Good morning or good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar. Due to technical difficulties, please be on standby for this webinar to begin. Thank you. If you have any questions, please type them into our chat box. Good morning, everyone. Again, thank you for joining us today. Due to technical difficulties, we are on standby, but we will start the webinar shortly, and thank you for your patience.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is Bill Maddox, another one of our series of Carsey School of Public Policy and Plan International webinars. Apologize for the delay. Sometimes you turn on your computer and it just doesn't do what you want it to do. And today was one of those days. So while my computer is figuring out what it's going to do today, I've jumped on to Bianca, our social media expert's computer, and I'm very happy to get our webinar underway. We are going to be talking about a very kind of interesting topic today, as usual, looking into some of the work that Plan has done, and specifically research as to how are savings groups making an impact on the payment of school fees, on the participation of children in schooling, and how does that affect the family overall. Despite the introduction of free primary education in many developing countries, households continue to face direct and indirect costs of education, particularly at higher levels of school, and for communities still dependent on subsistence farming. These are barriers to learning. Could access to better village-level facilities for savings and borrowing money to help lower these financial barriers? Plan International UK commissioned a report to better understand how and to what extent savings groups can help break down the financial barriers to education. An extensive review of research and evaluations of savings groups facilitated by Plan and others around the world was undertaken, as well as qualitative research in 2 communities in rural Ghana. The research suggests that while savings groups don't necessarily allow for increased household education spending or increased enrollment rates in the short term, probably the greatest potential comes from the income smoothing effect. Participants are able to pay formal and informal education fees in a more timely manner, thus reducing absenteeism. I'm really happy to have with us today, as usual, our co-moderator for this Carsey Plan series, John Schiller, who is the Global Advisor for Savings Groups for Plan International. John is responsible for promoting the methodology throughout Plan's 51 program countries and 20 national organizations. We also have with us today Stuart Cameron from Oxford Policy Management. Stuart is a senior consultant in the education team at a UK company, Oxford Policy Management, and leads the team's work on education for marginalized groups and educational inequalities. He specializes in mixed methods research, quantitative data analysis, evaluation of education programs, urban poverty, and policies for improving access to education. And finally, we have with us Karen Moore. Karen Moore is Youth Program Specialist for the MasterCard Foundation. Our webinar will start with a introduction by John Schiller, and then what we'd like to do is poll all of you and get a sense of your participation in terms of savings group work you're doing, linking your savings group work to improving access to education. So John, I'm sorry for the delay. I'm happy to introduce you and have you begin.
Thank you, Bill. Still here. And thank you to all the participants who are sharing part of your day with us. The genesis for this research was through a project called Banking on Change that Plan implemented alongside of CARE, financed by Barclays Bank in 11 countries. And in particular, the experience in Ghana, where over a 3-year period, Plan and CARE created savings groups that brought in about 63,000 people into the system, and had a fairly rigorous monitoring and evaluation component, part of which consisted of baseline and endline socioeconomic surveys. And when we compared the baseline and endline, we saw that there was a significant use of loans and shareouts dedicated to children's education, specifically with respect to 2 indicators. The number of households investing in children's education, there was a modest increase here. But in looking at average amounts invested, there was a much more significant change in a positive direction. The survey, however, didn't didn't discern any significant changes in enrollment. So more money was being spent, and households were doing slightly more in this regard, in supporting their children's education. We also did some qualitative research following the survey, and this showed that savings group members' perceptions of their children's access to education had significantly or slightly improved. That is, access to education had significantly or slightly improved. And this was a majority of those questioned who felt this way. And this was in contrast to the opinions of savings group members who had dropped out of the program, who felt much less strongly that there was improved access to education. Now, the project had made no particular effort to promote education investments. So we were wondering if this was particular to Ghana or whether it was perhaps part of a longer-term trend globally. We didn't know. So we decided to dig a bit deeper into the question after the project had ended. Now, Banking on Change had been managed by Plan UK, which had received the grant from Barclays. And this is where Karen Moore stepped in, because Karen, now working for MasterCard, was a former employee of Plan UK. She was the economic security advisor and managed a research portfolio. And it was Karen who actually conceived of this research and who brought about, or who drew up an agreement with Oxford Policy Management, represented today by Stuart Cameron, using money from DFID for this purpose. So that, in a way, is a bit of background and an introduction to what Stuart is going to present. But before we do that, I'm going to turn it back over to Bill, who is going to pose a polling question to get a sense of where you, the participants, are with respect to this question.
Incorrectly identified Karen Moore. I wanted to read her bio just briefly. She's program manager for Youth Livelihoods. Karen manages a portfolio of Youth Livelihoods project at the MasterCard Foundation, focusing on fostering access to skills, development, jobs, business opportunities, and financial inclusion. I want to make sure I got that correct. All right, so you should see a poll popping up. We want to get a sense of what kind of work you're doing out there with savings groups in relation to education. So the question you should see says, through your savings group work, have you been involved in any research linking savings groups and outcomes in education that you could share? It's a yes or no question. We're going to give you just about 10 or 15 seconds to answer, so please take part in the poll, and we'll see how many of you are actually doing this work from those that are participating in today's broadcast. All right, about 5 more seconds. Okay, that should have given everybody a chance to vote. What are the results? So out of the 21 people that participated in the poll, 14% of you are doing some kind of work related to education, and 86% aren't, and that's probably why you're here, because you want to learn more about this important work. So thank you very much for putting that up there, Bianca. And now I'm going to turn it back over to John to introduce Stuart.
Okay, so with that information as sort of a basis for our discussion, I'd like to give the floor to Stuart Cameron, who was the major or the head researcher on this project, and he's going to present what he found and some conclusions that he drew from from those findings. Stuart?
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Can someone just confirm that you can hear me okay?
We can hear.
Okay, great.
Yes, I hear you fine.
Okay, good morning. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining me. Just to say a bit about this research at the beginning, So I'm a consultant working at a UK firm, Oxford Policy Management. However, this work was done just before I joined Oxford Policy Management, when I was working as an independent consultant. And the research was done together with my co-author, who was Eric Ananga at the University of Education in Winneba, Ghana. And so unfortunately, he hasn't been able to join us today for this presentation, but co-authored the research and was jointly responsible for the fieldwork. So just to add a little bit to the context that we've mentioned at the beginning, the context of this research generally is the understanding that there remain in many developing countries financial barriers to education, and that these may in some cases include short-term access to cash, which is needed for parents to ensure that children stay in school continuously, to pay for the official and unofficial fees to keep children in school, and to pay other various educational costs. So this is perhaps from the outset the main way that we consider that savings groups might enhance access to education. So the question for this research was, does access to better village level facilities for saving and borrowing, such as the savings groups, which have been facilitated under Banking on Change and other programs, do these lead to improved educational outcomes, and do they lead to increased expenditure on education? And so our approach was firstly just a literature review, reviewing the various research and evaluations of savings groups, many of which do report on educational outcomes in one form or another, but it's it had not previously been gathered together into a single piece of research what those educational impacts might be. And secondly, a piece of qualitative research where we went to 2 villages in Ghana where Banking on Change projects were operating, and tried to investigate through interviews and focus groups with people who were involved and some people who were not involved in the savings groups, what were the potential effects on education of the groups. So at the outset of this research, we put together a kind of framework for understanding what we expected to be the possible mechanisms through which savings groups could have an impact on education. Now, if we think about the direct effects of the savings groups at the top, they are giving loans to people in the villages, and also providing a savings mechanism, as I'm sure most of the people here today are aware, whereby they receive a share out at the end of the year based on the amount that they've been saving. And a second sort of relatively direct effect, which has been documented for savings groups, is potential changes in household decision making, perhaps changes in who makes decisions within the household, with women making more of the decisions, depending on whether women are members of the savings groups or not, and perhaps changes in the way that people make decisions, perhaps encouraging them to save more, to spend less in the short term, and to plan ahead with their consumption, investment, and expenditure decisions. So if you look at the left of this slightly convoluted diagram, you have an arrow which goes straight from share outs and loans to spending on education expenses. So this is what we call the direct effect of the savings groups. The people who receive share outs from the savings groups, or who take loans from the savings groups, may be able to use this money directly to spend it on their education expenses, such as fees, books, tuition, other expenses, which helps them to meet the cost of education, ensure their children stay in school, ensure that they attend school regularly, and ultimately, we hope, ensure that they learn more. But I'm not going to go through in detail all of these other potential pathways which we've suggested here. But the suggestion is that there are a number of indirect mechanisms which may be just as important as the direct mechanisms. For example, we hope that the share-outs and loans which households receive from the savings groups may enhance their livelihoods over the medium to long term, leading to higher income in the medium to long term and greater spending on education expenses, perhaps a reduction in child labour, although as we'll see in a moment, the child labour effect may be rather ambiguous, and perhaps also effects through food, healthcare, nutrition, and through women's relative influence when it comes to households making education decisions. Okay, so the literature review revealed that there are a number of randomized controlled trials, notably for care programs in Ghana, Malawi, and Uganda, and for the USAID-funded savings group program in Burundi, and for Saving for Change, another program which is operated in Mali. And there are a large number of other evaluations which have not used the randomized controlled trial methodology, and which have varying degrees of controls. So if you, if you think about the aspects of an evaluation which can help to give us confidence in the results of that evaluation, firstly, it's ideal if you have a randomization so that you have some villages or some households are randomly assigned to take part in the savings group program, and you have a set of control villages which do not take part, but which are similar in other ways. Secondly, it's good if you have a baseline and where you measure certain aspects of the village, such as their educational expenditure before the savings group start, and you measure it at the end after, say, 2 years of savings group intervention. And basically, a lot of not all of these evaluations have these kind of characteristics. Sometimes they've simply done a survey at the end of the savings groups, and perhaps have asked households what they thought about the effects of the savings groups after some time for the savings groups to operate. Some of these evaluations have included focus group discussions and in-depth interviews, while many of them are predominantly quantitative. So the evaluations have revealed that the share-outs and loans from savings groups are often used for education, although not the main use, which tends to be for investing in business. The savings groups in some contexts have been associated with an increase in educational expenditures. However, there's a lack of strong evidence on savings groups leading directly to increases in education enrollment, but some smaller scale studies, mostly ones in Uganda and Ethiopia, have suggested a positive impact on enrollment. However, there is certainly evidence that a number of the indirect channels, which have suggested might be plausible channels for savings groups to increase educational expenditure and attendance in school and learning outcomes, notably an increase in business activity, some slightly mixed evidence, but some studies suggesting increases in assets and income, potentially either increases or decreases in child work. Some studies have suggested that as households participating in savings groups increase their business activity, this may actually draw more children into working on those businesses, which can potentially have negative effects on children's educational participation, while other studies have suggested a decline in child work, which is what you expect to see if families are increasing their incomes generally and no longer need to draw on child work to the same extent as they did previously. The study in Mali has suggested that savings groups have improved food security. But so far, there was little rigorous evidence of improvements in child health. There is evidence from the different studies of expenditure decisions shifting towards female household members. And we know from some previous studies that in some contexts, when household expenditure decisions shift towards women making more of those decisions, then there is often more of that expenditure going towards children's health and children's education and children's nutrition, which would tend overall to be good for children's educational outcomes. Finally, there's some evidence of savings groups acting as sites of collective action, which is maybe not always their primary intention, but is part of what they do. So sometimes initiating change at the village or community level to improve local education facilities or do other things to improve education in the village. To update the study, which was published, or first came out in 2013, I've done a rapid review of the evidence. I'm not going to go through this in the interest of time, but just to say that I haven't been able to identify a lot of new evidence since 2013 relative to this question. And it seems like the findings that we've published then are still largely relevant, but I'll be interested to hear from people who are listening today whether that's the case in their view as well. So to turn quite quickly to the primary research that we've done in Ghana, we went to 2 villages, one in the central region, where there are generally better educational indicators. The village was more connected to the urban economy with a range of diversified livelihoods. And then one village in the Upper West region where educational indicators are often very low. It was quite a remote village where people were generally very dependent on subsistence agriculture. We interviewed about 52 adult savings group members, 27 non-members, and 24 children. And we also interviewed teachers in the local schools and the community volunteers who were working on the savings groups with the communities. So our findings, firstly, to give a little bit of context, especially in the Upper West community, we noted a declining ability of people to live off the land in their own accounts, some outmigration of people who were unable to make their livelihoods in the village and were leaving for other places to take jobs, sometimes in the short term and sometimes longer term. And children, whether they were in school or out school, were often working, helping on families' farms and in the household. And parents often had high aspirations for their children, but also an immediate need for agricultural labor, and they noted fairly high levels of school costs relative to their incomes. And the problem was not so much with children not attending school at all, but with children attending erratically, and sometimes dropping out for a period of time because they had to work and because their families weren't always able to pay fees. In the end, they were ending up quite significantly over age compared to the age they were supposed to be in their grade. They were being held back until they could pass exams, and they were often not completing junior or secondary education by age of around 18, by which time they would be increasingly under pressure to drop out, either to take jobs or to marry. So the savings groups were sort of relatively mature in these villages, have been going on for up to 3 years. There were a number of different savings groups in the village. If I go straight to the sort of our evidence on direct educational impacts, we found, according to parents' accounts, that school attendance was improving in these villages, and that some did attribute this directly to the savings groups. They took small loans to pay school fees or buy uniforms, and this was seen as a very legitimate reason for taking loans, often seemingly encouraged by the groups and by the volunteers who were working with the communities. The share-outs were also used for paying school fees, but less frequently, because I think of the timing of the share-outs. And according to several accounts, fewer children were being sent home, particularly because of non-payment of school fees or to work on farms. And in the central region, which was the richer of the two regions where we did the study, we actually noted some movement from public to private schooling because of increasingly being able to pay the fees associated with private schools, and because in the particular village where we were studying, the public school had for several years been non-functioning and in a very bad state, and had only recently been repaired and able to accommodate the children in the village. Turning to these sort of various indirect effects that we hope to see from the savings groups, several interviewees had said their overall income had increased because they were able to invest their share-outs or loans in businesses, and they had channeled some of this higher expenditure back into education. There was some support from our interviews for the idea that savings groups had led to improved ability to pay for health and for food, and that migration away from the village, which could, well, disrupt children's schooling, had decreased. We were unable to say with confidence whether child work had increased or decreased, and we noted that there was still a need for occasional child work among the children in these villages. And there were some accounts definitely suggesting that savings groups had placed more income or more decision-making power over expenditure in women's hands, including over educational expenditures, and some evidence that rather than spending money on short-term expenditures, which are perhaps less strategic for the family, they had been able to save more and plan their expenditures more carefully and to manage their money better, which would include being able to keep money aside for educational expenditures. So to move quickly to some conclusions, we noted that many families were taking loans and using share-outs for education in our qualitative study, and that reinforces the findings that we had drawn from our literature review. However, actually pinning down whether this is translating into better educational outcomes, including attendance, enrollment, and ultimately better learning outcomes and better progress through the school system, is harder to pin down, partly because of the time scale of these studies, which is often quite short. We notice evidence from several contexts of increased educational expenditure and from some contexts of increasing enrollment. So our suggestion in the paper on this is that the main channel through which we would expect to see an impact of savings groups on education is a rather longer term one, which might be harder to identify in some of these studies, where gradual income improvements through households being able to invest in their businesses, leading to better livelihoods in the medium to long term, is combined with better ability to smooth your consumption, to hold aside money, to save small amounts and to use it when it's needed for educational expenditures, and to avoid this kind of frictional cost that can be associated with education, where people have to withdraw from education, perhaps for short periods, disrupting children's education because of inability to pay for the fees and other expenses associated with education. And there is also some tentative tentative evidence, perhaps not from the strongest studies so far, of indirect and longer term effects via health and nutrition. And I have a number of suggestions for further research, including the area of child labor is particularly important to look into. There is a potential risk that it could increase due to savings groups, and that I think needs some more investigation. As I've mentioned, there is a need for longer term research which can actually answer some of these questions about gradual improvements over time in income and whether those translate into improved educational outcomes. A lot of the studies are focusing only on educational expenditures, which is an interesting effect, but we can't always tell whether those educational expenditures, when families are using savings groups for educational expenditures, does it actually mean that they're increasing their educational expenditure? Are those educational expenditures partly responses to increases in school fees or increases in the cost of education on the supply side, or do they actually reflect increasing household decisions to spend more on education because they now have more money available? There's a lot more consideration could be given to the equity effects, especially in impact evaluations of studies. They're not always looking at differentiated outcomes in different wealth groups and different groups within the village. And we know potentially that savings groups can reach the poorest, but may not always reach the poorest within villages, and can sometimes be perhaps monopolized to some extent by although they may reach villages where the average level of income is very low, they may not always reach the most disadvantaged people within those villages. We consider that randomized trials are well suited to this type of evaluation where it's possible and where the funds are in place for those to be carried out. But we also note quite large variation across different contexts, which means that experimental trials from one context can't necessarily be generalized to others. And that means that smaller scale qualitative studies can be very important for illuminating these underlying processes. So thank you very much. And sorry, I've gone a little bit over my allotted time. There are some links on this final slide, and I hope that we can share this so you can download all of these papers more easily. There is a journal article on this, and there were also reports which were published directly through Plan, and a blog post if you wish to read more. And I'm happy for people to contact me for more information about this study.
Great, Stuart. Thank you for that concise rendering of your research and conclusions. Before I introduce Karen Moore, I'd like to remind participants that you, as many of you have already, you can provide comments through the chat box to help stimulate discussion later on. Karen, as I said at the beginning, is a former colleague. She worked for Plan UK. She's the one who conceptualized and managed this research. And we ask her to speak now to add certain points to what Stuart has already said. Karen?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, John, Bill, and Stuart. Thanks for running this webinar and for including me in it. As John and Bill mentioned, I'm currently a program manager with the MasterCard Foundation, but until a couple of years ago, I was Economic Security Advisor at Plan UK. So starting sort of with my Plan UK hat on, I think the main reason for commissioning this research was really to have a clearer and more detailed understanding of just how much we could rely on one of Plan's flagship approaches to household economic security, savings groups, in order to support children and youth's access to education, which is another key Plan goal. And from the education side, Plan UK's program partnership agreement with the UK government, which was focused on education across several countries, had a specific interest in this, and we were able to direct some UK-aged PPA funding towards this study. And as John and Stuart have explained, in the research and otherwise, PLAN had long heard from savings groups members about how education was a key focus for them. But in order for PLAN to make best use of savings groups and to know how much we could rely on them to really move the needle on educational access, we wanted to better understand the different mechanisms through which savings groups' education is operated and the level of improvement we could hope to see. And the finding that in Ghana and in similar contexts in which PLAN UK operates, that there's most likely to be this small but really significant effect on absenteeism reduction through income smoothing is a really helpful finding. And I think it has supported PLAN and its partners to develop more holistic programming that makes use of savings groups, but also invests in other aspects, including on the educational side, educational quality and sensitization about the importance of education, particularly for girls, but also on the economic side, broader economic opportunities for households. Putting on my MasterCard Foundation hat on now. So the MasterCard Foundation, through its partnerships, focuses on helping economically disadvantaged people in Africa find opportunities to move themselves, their families, and their communities out of poverty to a better life. And we do this through our programming in education, in financial inclusion, and through youth livelihood. And we recognize the power of savings groups. And over the past decade, we've partnered with PLAN Canada, but also with CARE, CRS, Freedom from Hunger, and others specifically on savings groups work, including youth savings groups work. And we also work with organizations like SysContact and others who draw on youth savings groups approaches to support a broader youth livelihoods program. And we've also found through our work on youth savings groups with PLAN Canada in West Africa and others, that youth themselves are supporting their own education and training goals, as well as that of their siblings and that of their children through their savings groups work. We've seen significant increases in the amount of resources that youth savings group members dedicate to their children's education. And we know that through a savings demand assessment report that was undertaken in 2015, that education is a key goal for youth when they're opening formal savings accounts as well. And when asked about that during the account opening, about almost 80% of the young people in Ghana, over 60% in Nepal, and over 30% in Kenya said that they were saving for their own education. While the research we discussed today was designed to focus on the really important economic and financial roles that savings groups can play, including supporting educational investments through all of the different mechanisms that Stuart laid out, it's also important to recognize the power of the group and of peer support. And I think this is something that the webinar series has also been delving into. And when it comes to education, we have some anecdotal evidence that for youth in savings groups, it's a combination of the savings generated, the loans accessed, and the emergency funds developed, but also the mutual support from within the group and the growing aspirations fostered by having a savings goal that is supporting some young women in particular to re-enter school or training after joining a savings group. So the MasterCard Foundation recognizes the incredible power of savings groups to provide an initial level of financial service to millions of households who are excluded from formal financial services, particularly across Africa. And we recognize that the income smoothing effects can have a significant impact on a wide range of productive and well-being enhancing outcomes, including education. But we also recognize that the scope of what savings group can achieve is limited somewhat by the economic resources of the community and of the group members, and the scale of its outreach can be limited by funding and NGO programming cycles. So for this reason, the Foundation has recently launched Savings at the Frontier, which is a partnership with a different part of Oxford Policy Management, that the one that Stuart works in, and I think a couple of Savings at the Frontier people might be on the line. And Savings at the Frontier will work to expand the range of financial services available for underserved populations in Ghana, Tanzania, and Zambia through shaping an innovative local financial service provider-led approach to work with community-based savings groups. And our hypothesis here is that through a bank or MFI or credit union-led approach to linking savings groups and its members to formal finance, but also potentially to facilitating savings groups themselves, both the scope, the scale, and even the strength of savings groups could be enhanced. And I'm really interested to see whether this might also work for education and training access for young savings group members themselves, as well as their siblings and their children. And I'd add this to Stuart's list of further research questions. So looking at the extent to which linkage and financial service provider approaches are going to enhance these broader educational outcomes, both in terms of scale and strength. I will shoot that back over, I think, to John now. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you, Karen. And I believe, Bill, now you wanted to administer a second poll before we get into our discussion period.
Sure, and the poll has just come up on the screen, and we're curious as to the kinds of research that you're interested in doing. Have you observed any links between savings groups and educational outcomes that you think could be subject of future research? So for those of you that have been running savings group programs and have seen these linkages, please answer yes. And for those that have not, no. We'll do this for about 15, 20 more seconds. And then I want to remind everybody while we're waiting for people to respond to the poll that we have both a chat box and a Q&A box, which some of you are already using. A few questions have piled up in a few comments, and we'll get into that in just a second. One other thing before the poll closes is I want to remind you that the recording for this webinar and associated documents such as a presentation and the full study and a brief were going to be posted within probably a few hours, if not a day later, on our SNBP webinar page, so you can have access to all of this information. Now, could we close the poll, please? All right, so out of the 22 folks that participated in the poll, 45% of you said that you have observed links that you could be the subject of future research, and 55% have said no. For those of you that did answer yes, it would be great for you if you want to put in a comment into the chat box or the Q&A box that you would like to share with participants. Then we'd be happy to briefly talk about your work. What I'd like to do now is move to the Q&A, and this has really been fascinating. I think the thing that we're seeing is that as we learn more and more about savings group programs that have been in communities for longer periods of time, we see that the impacts for education seem to be more and more prevalent. Let me get to our first question. Is from Larissa Schneider, and she asks, when you're looking at child labor, is that inclusive of all forms or the labor that takes children out of school? I guess a question for Stuart.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Perhaps it's best to avoid the term child labor, which has a specific meaning defined by the International Labour Organization in terms of how many hours children are working and what form of work. We've been looking at child work in whatever form, which can actually include paid and unpaid work in the household and outside it. That does not necessarily take children out of school, but in the Ghanaian village context, what we often found was that it will seasonally mean that children spend some time out of school because when it's the particularly busy time for them to work on the farm, then they will end up spending less time in school during that part of the year. Although school hours in those villages are actually to some extent geared up to allow children to work in the afternoons while still going to school in the mornings.
Okay, and a caller named Anonymous Viewer has asked, I would like to find out as to the reason for share-outs and loans leading to direct impact on education. Is it because they understand the need for education, or were there other reasons?
Okay, so the families we talked to in Ghana all expressed extremely strong aspirations around education, wanting to educate their children to the highest level possible. There was a strong sense of insecurity in the traditional livelihoods that they've undertaken, that the subsistence agricultural livelihood is not really secure because of decreasing agricultural yields and prices, increasingly unfavorable for them. So they certainly appreciate the need for education pretty strongly. And you can see in the central region where private schools were available, they were starting to put their children in private schools, even though they might not have a huge amount of money for that. I would add that the savings groups were in some cases explicitly encouraging educational expenditures as a potential thing that parents could take out loans for, which is kind of interesting when perhaps originally one would think of these savings groups as being focused on business investments, small businesses, and investment in perhaps farming tools or whatever. That they are encouraged to invest in education, which is an activity which obviously in the long term we expect to have financial returns for families as their children are able to get better paid jobs, but in the short to medium term has no financial return because you have to wait for a good 10 years or so for your children to go through the education process and find those jobs.
I'd also like to share a couple of comments that we have that came in from Ian Robinson, who says, under a MasterCard Foundation funded Savings at the Frontier program, research into savings groups done in the Ashanti and Volta regions in Ghana in May 2016 showed that the largest proportion, 40% of respondents, said that they used loans to help fund education. And Morton Kofoed has shared that our experience from our work in Burundi is that women report a changed and better balance in households' decisions. It's not sufficient scientifically, it's not scientifically, but it is follow-up on baselines, and we have some 120,000 members in our partner programs. Really impressive. And also comment from J.F. Johnson, who notes that Compassion International in Togo is planning to carry out research on savings groups. We have across our projects in Togo, and some of the aspects we want to explore are the impact of savings groups, teaching and activities carried out within groups on caregivers, care and involvement in the children and academic professional education. So he had asked about the methodology, and I think the report, which is very detailed, that Stuart has shared and we'll have up on the website, does go into the methodology and gives you enough information to begin with, and I'm sure that Stuart would be happy to discuss with you in detail some of the ways that the work was carried out.
Bill, if I could jump in.
Please.
The baseline endline comparison and the qualitative research that came out of Banking on Change, which predated research, we found that that men in Ghana had the primary responsibility for children's education. And that the impact of savings groups was that there were two things. There was more money in the hands of women, number one. And secondly, there seemed to be more discussion within the household on how that money, or how the household money, would be managed. So women were sort of contributing both directly and indirectly by having more resources to invest, household resources to invest, and then being able to influence their husbands to make those investments in children's education.
Great, thank you, John. I have another question from Larissa Schneider. Were there any financial institutions involved with the savings groups or digital financial solutions being implemented? I'm curious if there were any links between their aspirational savings for education versus savings for agriculture.
On the first part of that question, there were not, as far as I know, any financial institutions involved.
Yeah, I can jump in on that a little bit, I think. In particularly the qualitative research that was undertaken in Ghana, the work that Banking on Change did in linkage of savings groups with formal finance hadn't really started in earnest at that point. So these were, for the qualitative research, it was much more looking at the savings groups sort of on their own. And I think the majority, and Stuart, correct me if I'm wrong, the majority of the literature review also was looking at savings groups that weren't particularly linked to formal financial institutions. But as I said, this is definitely something that going forward I think will be interesting to keep an eye on. But in terms of the aspiration, the sort of investment mag versus investment in education, Stuart, back over to you.
And if I'm not mistaken, Karen, that's part of what Savings at the Frontier will be able to help look at is because it's focused on linkages between financial institutions and savings group programs. Then obviously some of the questions that might come up would be how can these financial institutions kind of support the overall goals of savings groups, which might include higher educational participation, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So Rachel Lindley has asked the question, was there any evidence of different educational outcomes for girls versus boys, young women versus young men in this research?
In short, no, we didn't find particular differences between girls and boys. I'm just trying to, I mean, there are different reasons, different things affecting girls and boys in terms of, for example, other demands on their time. Particularly quite a high demand for boys' work, to work in agriculture. So although, I mean, this was a small, our Ghana study was obviously quite small scale, and we didn't try to quantify whether there were differences between boys and girls in terms of education enrollments or the outcomes of the savings groups. But I haven't seen that reported in any of the other research in the literature either. So it's an interesting area.
Great, thank you, Stuart. I don't see any other questions. And I want to see if either John, Karen, or Stuart have any final comments that you'd like to make.
I think there was a question, or part of a question, about aspirations linked to investments in agriculture. And we can say anecdotally that a lot of savings groups decide not to make loans to members for investment in agriculture when that agriculture is rain-fed agriculture, which is inherently risky and perceived by members to be so, and therefore puts in jeopardy the resources of the group. So that's, again, I've never seen statistics on that, but when you do visit savings groups, large numbers of savings groups, many have that opinion.
Great, yep. There was actually one more question that just popped in. This is from D. Kula Azi. It says, how about impact on adult education? Is there any reasons for this?
We didn't notice, I mean, as far as I know, there were no explicitly adult education programs or interventions available in these two villages. However, it's worth noting that a lot of the school-going students were so above the official age ranges that they were, in fact, adults and over 18. I mean, some evidence that it was helping to keep those students in school to the end of secondary school.
Yeah, and just to add on, when we talk about youth savings groups, normally we're speaking about age 15 to 24. Some groups have younger youth in them, some also have older youth in them. So some of those young people will also be legally adults, and as I say, anecdotally, we're not only seeing them investing in their own education and that of their siblings and their children, but sometimes also in training, so more of the vocational training or the opportunities to access livelihoods. So I think it's not something we have robust evidence around, but our feeling is yes, there is some use of savings groups towards youth supporting their own educational and training interests as well.
Great. Well, thank you, Karen. All right. Well, we started a little late, unfortunately, because of some technical difficulties. So we are a little bit over time. If Stuart, if you could put the final slide up. I want to thank John and Karen and Stuart. This has really been interesting. We could probably have gone on for another half an hour to an hour in discussion about this. I think as we're seeing, there's great interest in this. There's a lot of anecdotal information. There's obviously some good research that's been done, but a need for more research. We see savings group members are prioritizing education frequently, and that it is beginning to make impacts. Those impacts can be probably better measured as the groups get older and it becomes a more focused part of what savings groups are doing. But I think the research so far is impressive and points in a great direction. I appreciate the work that Stuart and Karen have done and Plan UK and the support of the MasterCard Foundation and actually DFID, who had supported this original study. And appreciate everybody taking time out of today's busy schedule to be with us, and apologize for the delays. I want to just briefly mention to you that we do have some upcoming SMDP workshops. SMDP Online will be starting in a couple of weeks, adaptive problem solving and program design for savings groups, SACCOs, and other member-owned models, October 24th to March 24th, 2017. With Nancy Lee, our facilitator, and several guest experts. And also coming up in November, SMDP Kenya, Savings Group Program Design, and Implementation and Management, and Savings Group Management Information Systems. This will be November 28th to December 9th in Nairobi, Kenya, with facilitators Hugh Allen and Andrew Majama. And you can click on the link below in this slide, or just go to carc.unh.edu SMDP for more information, including possibility of applying if you're an African women practitioner for MasterCard Foundation scholarships, which we have available. Again, I want to thank everybody for taking their time. I want to thank Plan for their great sponsorship of this webinar series. We do have one more webinar coming up in November. We're still negotiating the date, but it looks like it'll probably be on November 2nd. Savings Group Plus, what is the impact of savings groups on orphans, vulnerable children, and families with HIV, and we'll give you more details on that. We thank everybody for being with us today and appreciate your patience with our technical difficulties, and wish you a good morning, good afternoon, or good evening wherever you are. Thank you. This is Bill Maddox from the CARC School of Public Policy in Durham, New Hampshire. Good day.